You honestly think you're ready for this, Pops?
Is that the guy from the article?
Get that old man off my mat. Those were the first words Sergeant First Class Marcus Cobb said when he saw the grey-haired stranger standing at the edge of the training floor, weight shifted to one side, a scuffed canvas bag set down neat by his boots. The recruits laughed because Marcus laughed, the way young soldiers always do. Nobody noticed that the old man's right boot didn't flex like the left one when he settled his stance. Nobody noticed that he never laughed back. He only watched, patient, the way a man watches weather coming in over a ridge. And when Marcus peeled the folded bill from his waistband, snapped it flat between two fingers and called across the mats. "Tell you what, old-timer, $1,000, cash, if you can put me on my back," the old man finally answered. 2 words, quiet enough that the front row had to lean in to catch them. "All right, friend. If you have been written off because of grey hair, a limp, or a soft voice, type still sharp in the comments right now, because what this old man did in the next 5 seconds is the reason this story will outlive every man who watched it happen." His name was Raymond Vance, and almost no one left on that post remembered it. He had driven in that morning in a 20-year-old pickup, parked it where the visitors park, and walked the long way across the lot because the long way was flatter, and his knee, the one that ended 4 inches below the joint, preferred flat ground on cold mornings. He wore a plain windbreaker over a plain shirt. No rank, no ribbons, nothing that announced him. To the eye, he was exactly what Marcus took him for. Somebody's grandfather, lost on a military installation, an old man who had wandered through the wrong door and out onto the wrong floor. That was the thing about Raymond Vance, though. He had spent a lifetime being the most dangerous man in rooms where nobody believed it, and somewhere along the way he had stopped minding. He let people see what they wanted to see. It had never once cost him anything he couldn't afford to lose. The combatives' house was loud that morning, packed with new recruits in fresh PT gear, the air thick with the smell of rubber mats and nervous energy. They had been told a special instructor was coming, a guest, somebody the cadre spoke about in lowered voices, the way men speak about a name they were trained to respect. The recruits had pictured someone like Marcus, only bigger. Marcus Cobb was the kind of instructor recruits remembered. 31 years old, 6'2", all shoulders and certainty. A competition grappler who had never been beaten on that floor and made sure everyone knew it. He was not a cruel man. That matters to what comes later. He was simply young and good and had never once in his life been handed a reason to doubt himself. So when the old man would not leave, would not be shooed off, only stood there with those patient eyes, something in Marcus's pride decided to make a teaching point out of him. "Come on," Marcus said, rolling his neck, playing to the room. $1,000. All you gotta do is put me on the deck. Old guy like you must have wrestled back in the day, right? Show these kids how they did it. In the dark ages, the recruits ate it up. A couple of them had their phones out, grinning, certain they were about to watch a harmless old man embarrass himself for their entertainment. Raymond Vance looked at the young instructor for a long moment, looked at his face, really, in a way that made 1 or 2 of the sharper recruits stop grinning, without quite knowing why. Then his eyes dropped, just for a second, to the names stitched across the young man's chest. COBB, and something moved behind the old man's face, like a stone settling slowly to the bottom of deep water. He folded his windbreaker and laid it over the canvas bag. He stepped onto the mat in his socks, and now the prosthetic showed plain below the hem of his trousers carbon and titanium, where a shin used to be. The room went quiet on its own. Marcus, to his credit, hesitated. "Hey, look, old man, I'm not actually gonna—" "You made an offer," Raymond said. "A man keeps his offers." And he set his stance. Here is what the recruits did not understand, and what Marcus was about to learn the hard way. A below-the-knee amputee who truly knows what he is doing does not fight the way a young man fights. He does not chase. He does not lunge. He plants what he has. He makes the other man come to him, and he lets the other man's own size and speed do the work of putting him down. Raymond Vance had taught that exact principle to 2 generations of soldiers on floors precisely like this one. He stood with his weight stacked over his good leg, the prosthetic forward as a post, hands low and open, and he waited. The same way he had waited at the edge of the mat all morning, the same way he had waited 35 years. Marcus circled, still half smiling, and then, because the room was watching, smile like that needs a finish. He committed. He shot in low and fast the way he had taken down 100 younger men who never saw it coming. He never reached him. Raymond's lead hand caught the inside of Marcus's wrist and dragged it hard across his own body. An arm drag, the oldest trick on any mat in the world, turning all that forward weight clean off its line. Marcus's momentum, the very thing that made him dangerous, became the thing that owned him. The old man pivoted on the prosthetic, dropped his hips low beneath the bigger man's center of gravity, and let plain physics finish the sentence. Marcus Cobb went up and over and flat down onto his back, hard enough to clap the air out of the entire room. Raymond's hand was already at his collar, his good knee already pinning the shoulder to the mat, the whole position locked before Marcus's brain had even caught up with the ceiling. 5 seconds, maybe 4. The phones kept filming, but there was not a single grin left in the building. For a moment nobody moved at all. Marcus lay flat on his back, blinking up at a man 3 times his age and half a leg short, and the certainty drained out of his face the way colour drains out of a wall. Then a voice came from the back of the room, a hard-carrying, parade-ground voice that every soldier present recognized in their spine a half-second before they recognized the man. "On your feet, Sergeant." Command Sergeant Major Otis Hartley stood in the doorway, the senior enlisted soldier on the entire post, and he was not looking at Marcus. He was looking at the old man on the mat, and his weathered face had gone soft in a way that none of those recruits had ever seen on it before. He crossed the floor slow. He stopped square in front of Raymond Vance. And the Command Sergeant Major of the whole post came to attention and rendered a slow, deliberate salute to a man standing there in his socks. "Master Sergeant Vance," Hartley said, "it's an honour, same as it ever was." The recruits' heads turned as one. Master Sergeant. The old man they had fumbled to shoo off the mat, the lost grandfather, the joke was a retired Master Sergeant being saluted by the most powerful enlisted soldier any of them had ever stood near. Hartley turned to face the room, and his voice dropped into the cadence of a man telling a truth he has carried for a long, long time. "That manual, some of you trained out of this week, the close quarters program at this post. The man standing in front of you wrote the first version of it 30 years back, on this very floor. Half the instructors who trained your instructors, he trained them. You were told a special guest was coming today to run your class." He let that hang in the air. He is not a guest. He is the reason any one of you knows how to stand on a mat at all. This is the instructor you have been waiting for. Marcus Cobb was on his feet now, breathing hard, and the look on his face was no longer plain humiliation. It was something closer to fear, the specific fear of a man who senses he has just stumbled into something far larger than his own bruised pride, because the old man had not stopped looking at him, not once, not even from down on the mat. And Raymond Vance, in the quiet that pooled after the sergeant major's words, finally said the thing he had crossed a parking lot and the better part of a lifetime to say. "Cobb," he said softly, "you'd be Daniel's boy." The young instructor went very, very still. How do you know my father's name?" "Because I carried him out of a burning track outside the breach line in February of '91, Raymond said. "And I have spent 35 years wondering whether that boy ever made it home. If you understand what that man just said, if you feel the full weight of it land, type honor in the comments. Because this is the part of the story the title could never tell you. The room had gone so silent you could hear the rubber mats settle under their own weight. Raymond Vance was not looking at recruits anymore, or at a sergeant major, or at a mat he had once owned the way other men own their names. He was looking 35 years backward into a stretch of desert, and he told it plain. The way men who were actually there always tell it. A young soldier named Daniel Cobb, 19 years old, pinned in a vehicle that had struck a mine during the ground war. Fire already climbing up through the floor of the thing. Raymond, a master sergeant then, going back in when going back in made no kind of sense at all. Getting the boy loose, getting him clear of it. And the part of the story the boy himself had never known, that as the fire took the vehicle, it took Raymond's leg below the knee along with it, and that in the screaming chaos of the evacuation, the two of them were lifted onto different birds, flown to different hospitals on different continents, and never once crossed paths again. The army is an enormous thing. Men vanish into it without meaning to. Raymond medically retired, went quiet, and spent 3.5 decades not knowing whether the kid he had pulled out of that fire had lived another hour or another 50 years. He reached into the pocket of the windbreaker he had folded so carefully a few minutes before, and he drew out a single dog tag on a worn cord, the metal gone smooth and dull from being carried in a pocket for half a lifetime. "This came off him when I pulled him through the hatch," Raymond said. "I have meant to put it back in Daniel Cobb's hand every single day for 35 years. He held it out toward Marcus, and that steady old voice finally caught and snagged on something. "Somebody told me last month that Dan Cobb's son was teaching combatives up here, so I drove up. I thought maybe I could finally hand this back to the man himself." Marcus Cobb took the tag in both hands like it was made of glass. And then he was the one who had to say it out loud, because the old man had built his entire fragile hope around not yet knowing. "He made it home," Marcus said, and his voice broke clean down the middle. "He raised me. He told me about you my whole life. He never had your name, but he told me about you." He used to say. The young man stopped, dragged the back of his wrist hard across his eyes, and forced himself to finish it. He used to say that if I ever met a one-legged old grappler who could put a man twice his size flat on his back in about 5 seconds, I should shut my mouth and shake his hand, because that was the man he owed everything to. He looked down at the patch of mat where 90 seconds earlier he had landed flat on his back. "Dad passed last spring. He never once stopped looking for you." Here is where this story could have turned cruel, and did not. Because cruelty was never what Raymond Vance was about, and it was never what his program was about either. He did not gloat. He did not let the young man drown in his shame on a floor full of staring recruits. He stepped in close and put a hand on Marcus Cobb's shoulder, the same hand that had dropped him a minute before, and he said the only thing that needed saying. "Then you're already family, son. And your father raised himself a fine instructor. I felt that the second you came in at me, you've got everything except the one part nobody can teach you while you're young and unbeaten." He nodded toward the watching recruits. "The day you stop being able to see the dangerous man inside the quiet one, that's the day you stop being any use to these kids at all. I came up here to teach a class. Looks to me like the first lesson already taught itself." And the recruits who had pulled out their phones to laugh at a lost old man now stood in a silence none of them would ever fully be able to explain to anyone who had not been standing in that room. He taught the class. Of course he taught the class. For 3 hours that old man in his socks worked up and down the line on a leg that ended below the knee, fixing a grip here, a base there, his voice never once rising above the level of a man, telling you something true across a kitchen table, and every recruit in the place hung on it like scripture. Marcus Cobb did not run the floor that day. He stood at the old man's shoulder, and he learned his father's dog tag tucked down inside his shirt against his chest, and at the very end of it, he did the one thing his father had been telling him to do his whole life. He shut his mouth, and he shook the man's hand. And the recruits walked away with a lesson that no manual at any post in the country has ever once managed to print. The one Raymond Vance had been teaching with his entire life and his missing leg, that the most dangerous and the most valuable man in any room is almost never the one announcing himself, and that the grey-haired stranger you are halfway to dismissing may turn out to be the only reason you are standing where you stand at all. The last thing those recruits saw that afternoon was the old man walking the long flat way back across the parking lot toward his 20-year-old truck, the canvas bag swinging easy in his hand, his gait uneven and entirely unhurried. Only this time, nobody was laughing. This time, a room full of young soldiers stood crowded in the open doorway and watched him go the way you watch something you understand you were lucky just to have stood near. And Sergeant First Class Marcus Cobb stood alone at the edge of the empty mat where the whole thing had started. The very same edge that quiet old man had stood at that morning, written off and patient and waiting, with his hand pressed flat over his father's dog tag, finally, fully understanding the thing his father had been trying to hand him his entire life. If this story moved you, if you believe the men who gave the most are too often the ones we manage to notice the least, subscribe and stand with us here, because as long as we keep telling it, no quiet old man who once carried somebody out of the fire ever has to disappear back into it alone.